It was well past midnight when Paul was driving his taxi through the winding roads at the limits of Swamp City. He drove slowly as he carefully observed the shoulder for any possible hitchhikers. Swamp City was full of interesting people, and Paul was one of its many taxi drivers. Most didn't dare venture beyond the inner city lights during the night, but Paul found that he did his best work at night on these streets. Hitchhikers on these roads weren't picky about who picked them up. Occasionally, they were even able to pay, but whether they were able to pay or not, Paul was willing to help them. He watched the shoulder as a light drizzle came down overhead. Despite himself, Paul imagined what it would be like to be out here late at night. Maybe you're a college student who needed to get away from a party that was getting too rowdy, so you needed to walk yourself home because your ride was too drunk to find their keys. So now you are trying to guide yourself home because no bus goes out this far, and taxi services keep refusing to go out this way. So you walk, trying to do the right thing. And then a pair of headlights follow behind you. Your first instinct is hope. Maybe it's someone else who left the party, or someone who's coming to help. But then you think about what's more likely. Maybe just another random driver who happened on the same trail. Maybe they would still be able to help you. But then that hope becomes fear. What if the car approaching you is dangerous? They may be a killer, or worse. And then they see the yellow paint and the white glowing words, taxi. And that fear and hope turns to joy as they stick their thumb out and Paul pulls over. He remembered all those relieved looks when he arrived. He had seen many warm smiles across the years, which only made their screams so much nicer when they finally knew who he was. It made his heart beat so fast when he saw hope turn to terror, and made him feel so alive when he finally knew that they were dead, but their hearts weren't done beating yet. Paul was one of the many killers within Swamp City. During the day, he was just a normal taxi driver in Swamp City, a hunched-over, skinny man behind the wheel and behind the bulletproof glass. But at night, he was finally able to play, and like the many others who were like him, he had to find a niche that he wouldn't himself be killed in. Killing people during the day was too likely to bring some kind of police officer, or a vengeful family member, down on his neck. And working the streets of the inner city were too likely to make him a target. Almost anyone in the street would either be on the prowl like him, or they were wolves just waiting for a little pup like him to eat up. But out here on the winding streets of the outer city, this was where he found his niche. Out here, the other killers were more like sleepy spiders, waiting for their juicy meals to simply get stuck while they played and tortured at their leisure. They waited in their shacks, their summer camps, gas stations, and abandoned homes, but they didn't bother going to the roads where Paul prowled. Hitchhikers here knew it was dangerous, so they didn't risk the homes nor asking for help. But when they saw a taxi go by, well, something in them changes. Suddenly, a creepy stranger becomes a trusted professional. While Paul didn't always find someone on these roads every time, but when he did find someone, they always agreed to ride with him. And while Paul didn't kill everyone he picked up, he did kill most. And while Paul reminisced about his past, he saw just ahead of him a lone figure wandering through the rain. Paul saw that the figure was a woman in the rain, dressed in a long pink scarf and leather rave clothes, with shoes definitely not made for this weather. As he slowed his car to get a better look, she stuck out her arm with her thumb up, as Paul pulled his cab over. The woman approached the back seat and opened the door, coming in from the rain. "Can you bring me back to Swamp City? I don't have any money on me, but if you can bring me to my apartment, I can pay you back with my checkbook," the woman said. But the way she spoke, the way she turned her head, Paul had already made his decision. "Sure, come on in. I'll get you home, free of charge," Paul lied. As Paul began to drive the back roads towards the inner city, He decided to kill time by talking with the woman in the back seat. Other than offering to pay and giving him an address at the edge of the inner city and the suburbs, she hadn't spoken up at all. So, after a few minutes of traveling, Paul decided to talk to her. "Do you have a name?" he asked, and she only nodded in response. "Well, what is it?" "Emma." "Emma, that's a pretty name." "My name's Paul," he responded, and she only nodded in response. After a few moments, he tried a different tactic. "So, what are you doing out here?" "My date left me out here." "Oh no, that's horrible. Why did he leave you out here?" Paul asked, and Emma made eye contact with Paul for the first time. It was through the mirror, but Paul could see that her green eyes were puffy from crying. "He wanted something I wasn't able to give him, so he left me out here all alone, and I've been wandering this road for a very long time." Paul gulped at her story. It was sad, but it only made the situation even better for him. If her date left her out here, then he would be on the hook, not Paul. And of course, all of the swamps of Swamp City left plenty of places to dump a body that would be eaten before anyone would discover it. And that was if anyone cared enough about Emma to even bribe the SCPD to look for her. Paul felt his mind smile while he thought about the knife in his glove box. As he went down the roads, he followed his own personal path. He heard Emma shift uncomfortably in her seat. He didn't say anything, but he was familiar with what she was feeling. Every time he did this, they got a bit uncomfortable around now, but they also wanted to avoid being rude, just in case they were misunderstanding something. So right now, she was just rationalizing what was happening. She was probably thinking that he knew a way that she was unfamiliar with, but in time, she would try to ask questions when she got uncomfortable enough. Paul felt his grip tighten on the steering wheel as he knew his plan. After driving a mile further away from Swamp City, he quietly opened his glove box and felt a familiar handle in his fingers. His calluses filled the ridges of the knife like pieces of a puzzle. He was certain what he was going to do with this. "Hey, I think the way to the suburbs is behind us?" Emma asked in a timid tone, which Paul responded with a practice line. "This is a shortcut," he said, his voice no longer friendly. Emma only sighed and looked out the window again. Something was wrong here. Emma didn't appear scared. She seemed bored, if anything. So trying to turn up the fear, Paul tried a different tactic. "What makes you think I was on the wrong route?" Paul asked. "I've wandered these roads for a very long time. This road doesn't lead to Swamp City," Emma said in her bored tone as they traveled further and further down the road. Paul was quiet as he continued his travel down the ever-narrowing road. The branches of the trees scraped the edges of the taxi, even though Emma didn't so much as flinch. Normally by now he was used to passengers trying the doors, only to find out the safety locks were on, or they tried to attack Paul through the bulletproof glass, or at least they tried to negotiate a way out for themselves. But not Emma. Her tears appeared to be spent, and she had no more to spare for Paul. Now at the end of the road there was a small elevated clearing, where all the other sides were surrounded by foggy swamp, where the water was obscured by the fog. And Paul knew the alligators loved to hang out in these waters, because he'd been feeding them very well. Now parked, Paul grabbed his knife when he heard Emma speak again. "This isn't home. I need to get home," Emma said. "Shut up," Paul said as he held out his sharp knife, where Emma could see it through the window. She only yawned when she saw it. What was wrong with this woman? Opening the door, Paul expected her to run, or to try to run, or maybe kick him, or try to back away further into the cab. But instead, she just sat there, staring first out to the swamp and then turning her puffy green eyes up at him, making eye contact. "Can you please take me home?" she asked. Paul responded by grabbing her by her hair and dragging her out of the car. Emma didn't scream. She didn't even try to fight back, and she didn't look him in the eyes. even as Paul lifted her up so he was eye to eye to her. Her eyes looked down at the ground, glazed over with boredom, like she was a million miles away. "Can you please take me home?" she asked just before Paul stabbed his knife into her throat, making a smile on her neck. Even then, she didn't so much as flinch. It was like she was already dead and she didn't care. Something was very wrong with this woman, but he knew he now took care of it. Whatever was wrong with her, it was over, and she couldn't bother anyone anymore. It was a simple task, a twist and a tug, and her scarf was removed from her body, and he held her head in his hands. Holding her head up by her hair, he looked to admire her face. Her eyes were closed in a peaceful, eternal rest, and the only thing staining her pale face was her dark red blood. But then Emma's eyes fluttered and then opened. Her eyes finally focused on Paul's eyes again for the second time that night. But where earlier she was clearly sad and depressed, now she was angry and her eyes were as dry as the desert. "Take me home," she whispered, which caused Paul to drop her head. And after a moment of leaving the head on the ground and letting his heart stop racing, he picked up her head again. Emma's eyes were still closed and she wasn't moving. He must have just been hearing things. He did hear rumors that people's heads remained conscious for 30 seconds after decapitation. Maybe he just saw her eyes flutter open and his mind filled in her voice. Satisfied with his answer, he took Emma's head and threw it into the water, where he heard something splash after the head. Probably the gators getting their fill tonight. He then dragged the body by her feet, leaving her scarf in the dirt, and when it finally made it to the water's edge, he simply kicked the body inside. But this time, the water was silent. No crickets, no splashes, no frogs croaking, no wind, nothing. Paul felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as he brandished his knife. Whatever was out there, he wasn't going to give it an easy meal. Paul felt a breeze blow by his ear as he became aware of a presence behind him. "Take me home," Emma's voice said as he spun around with his knife, slashing at the air. There was nothing behind him, but he felt the chill crawl up his neck again. "Take me home," Emma's voice came from behind him, and then it echoed behind a tree in the swamp. "Take me home." And then it echoed above him. "Take me home." And then in front of him. "Take me home." Paul covered his ears as Emma's voice came from seemingly everywhere in the swamp at once, before suddenly it stopped, and after a moment of silence, Paul removed his hands from his ears. The swamp now had the croaks of frogs and the chirps of crickets. He finally felt comfortable enough to wipe his knife with a paper towel, leaving the towel in the water as he picked up her scarf, knocking off the dirt. His own memento for this very strange night. Maybe Emma was esoteric, but even if she was esoteric, no being could survive without their head. Paul tucked the scarf into a plastic bag and put it in the seat next to him, a personal trophy for his kill. People, like him, liked to collect trophies. He knew the Stalker of Swamp City liked collecting hair accessories, or the hair itself. He also knew that the night nurse took pictures of the bodies of the people she killed, posting them online months after the bodies were buried, with a full description of how she killed them and why she killed them. She had quite a following on Share My Day, and even a podcast. But Paul wasn't as public as the night nurse, and he didn't have high-profile deaths like the Stalker, so he wasn't given a name by the newspapers. But he didn't mind that too much. He doubted either of those two had as high of a kill count as he did, and he knew that fame would inevitably invite challenge. So, as he drove his way back to the Swamp City, he heard a knock on the glass behind him. "Are you taking me home?" he heard Emma whisper in his ear. As he tried to keep control of his car, he slowly glanced at his mirror to look into his back seat. And there he saw Emma sitting on the seat, covered in mud and swamp slime, still wearing the leather rave clothes, but her scarf missing, revealing the smile that he cut into her throat, still bleeding onto his seats and onto her clothes as she spoke again. "Take me home," she said as Paul braked hard, turning around to look at his back seat. And she was gone. His seats were clean and there was no blood anywhere. He took the moment to take deep breaths and to try to process what happened. He never had waking nightmares or hallucinations before, but something about this kill had affected him. Maybe he needed to take a break from killing for a while. Turning back to the road, he turned on his radio, listening to the newest song from Mach 5. As her voice screamed about the pillars of bone oiled by the blood of the innocent, Paul calmed down enough to continue driving. As he made his way to the suburbs, he drove carefully as he saw a figure sitting on a bus bench. He glanced only for a moment before he felt a chill run up his spine, seeing a woman coated in mud. Glancing back and focusing on her, he let out a relieved sigh. Seeing that it wasn't Emma, it was just a homeless woman, Paul continued his way home for the night. Finally, after a good night's sleep, Paul was able to relax. He hadn't seen Emma since those strange hallucinations last night. Now he was able to focus on doing his job. After a quick breakfast, he got into his taxi, turned on his radio, and drove around Swamp City. The process of accepting fares was a complicated one. He could be radioed in by the office to be guided to a passenger who needs a ride, or sometimes the little computer on his dash would ping him that someone requested a ride through the app, and he got a request, and he had to take it before a different driver did, much like bidding. Or, of course, there was the old-fashioned way. Someone sees the vacant lights on top of the cab and raises their arm, so he picks them up. It was a lot to do, but he was rarely bored, as he didn't even make it to the end of the block before there was a ping on his dashboard. Someone was requesting a ride. Driving his cab to the pickup point, Paul pressed the button which started the timer. While he waited, he was charging fare, and when he started moving, his fare box would start counting kilometers rather than time until they made it to their destination. Already, a businessman in a suit and briefcase made his way to the cab. Opening the door, he practically threw himself inside. Paul was already moving by the time the man closed the door. He was barely buckled up by the time Paul made it to the end of the street. The fare box counted distance, not time when he was moving, so if he took too long, he lost out on other fares. Plus, if he made it there quickly, he usually got tipped. As he continued his way to the address on the GPS, Paul tried making conversation with the man. "So, where are you going?" Paul asked, only to be responded to by a familiar feminine voice. "I want to go home," he heard Emma's voice say as Paul looked back at the businessman. "What did you say?" "I said I'm going to work," the businessman said in frustration, as he began to check his phone instead, using the opportunity to ignore Paul, who was now focusing really hard on the road. He didn't want to think or hear her anymore as he focused on his driving. He started to notice things out of place everywhere. At a bus stop, he saw a young woman staring just a little too hard at his taxi, and when he looked back, the woman was just looking at her phone. Or he saw her pink scarf float on the breeze, even though it was locked up in his house, but then when he got a second look, it was just trash. So after a while, Paul just decided to ignore all the weird things, figuring that they weren't hurting him. On his lunch break, Paul was sitting on the picnic bench eating his burger and fries as he heard someone sit down across from him. "When are you taking me home?" Emma's voice said. Paul didn't bother looking up, deciding to just not engage with the hallucinations. As he reached out for his fries, her eyes grabbed his hands tightly. As her nails dug into his hands, there was a loud thunk as something heavy hit the picnic table. And Paul watched in horror as Emma's severed head rolled just behind his food. her green eyes staring up at him as she spoke again. "Take me home." When Paul saw that, he pulled away from the bench as her hands tore at his arms. And when he stood up and realized she wasn't there, he thought it must have been another hallucination. At least that was what he thought, until he saw that his arms were bleeding from the long gashes from where she was holding him before he tore away from her. If that was real, then were they all real? "What do you want?" he asked as he heard Emma's whisper again. "I want to go home." Now, knowing what to do, Paul began to make his plans. After Paul called out for the rest of the day, he drove to where the address for Emma's home was. Even though he last heard it last night, he still remembered the address because it was unique. 1789 Foxglove Way, number 80. And as he drove away from the busy inner city towards the suburbs, he became aware of a passenger in the back seat. In the mirror, he could see Emma sitting there, twirling her scarf in her fingers as she stared out the window. However, this time she was quiet. And why wouldn't she be? He was taking her to where she wanted to go, so of course she was quiet. Paul decided now wasn't the time to ask her what was going on. With the sun setting, Paul finally pulled up to the address, and he gulped when he saw what was there. The Swamp City Cemetery. While Paul debated simply turning around and living with this ghost, what he heard from Emma convinced him he needed to keep going. "Almost home, almost home, almost home," she started chanting as Paul pulled into the cemetery. It took a lot longer for Paul to find number 80 than he thought, but fortunately the graveyard sexton gave him directions towards the oldest part of the cemetery. Here, most of the gravestones had moss-covered stone skulls on them. At least, Paul assumed they were stone. As he traveled through the rows, he finally found the stone marked with number 80, and he walked to the front of the stone, reading over the epitaph. A chill ran up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold evening air. On the tombstone was his name, Paul Pembroke, and there was his date of birth, and the date of death was today. Paul felt his breath catch in his throat as Emma stood behind him. Her cold whisper brought another shiver through his entire body. "Welcome home," she said, pushing him down into the dirt. As Paul tried to scramble out of the dirt, only for something to grab at him. Paul squirmed and punched, trying to break out, but only more and more muddy hands broke out of the ground, grabbing at him and pulling him into the ground. In the dim light, he saw that the faces belonging to the hands were all familiar. They were rotten. They were covered in blood and mud, but Paul recognized all of them. They were all his victims across these years. Dozens, if not hundreds of them were now pulling him underground to be buried alive. As Paul screamed, filling his lungs full of dirt, the sky above being closed away, he had no final thoughts as he disappeared into the darkness. Above ground, a woman was sitting on the grave dirt, examining herself in her own mirror. Her scarf was moved as she traced her fingers across the cut on her neck. There she could see rot was continuing to spread from the cut. And since it was still spreading, that meant that Paul wasn't the man who removed her head. And the rot would continue to spread until either he was dead, or there was nothing left of the woman. After she finished examining her wound, she wrapped her scarf around her neck, tightening her head back to her body. After her scarf was on, she slid on her jacket to keep her warm in the cold weather. But what made this jacket unique was that on her breast pocket was a stitched picture of a gorgon inside of a golden shield. The night was quiet as the woman with the long scarf wandered the dark streets of Swamp City.